Okay, cool.
So as far as the algorithm goes, algorithm is to focus on conservation area design. You know, I think we've all seen this dumbbell figure and identifying. You want to identify where your core areas are, the corridors between them, some good buffer zones, and you want to try and do it in such a way that it's cost-effective. It's representing all the different habitats, species that you want to represent, but doing so without the whole landscape. You know, they have a variety of different applications out there. This particular algorithm is based on the idea of continuous benefit function.
Hi, sorry to interrupt you, John. Does somebody have their, could somebody with maybe some background noise in their, on their speaker mute their microphone? Oh, that's much better. Thanks.
That was just coming on and off a little bit. Thanks for that. I think that was Mark that mentioned that. So getting into this quickly, this is kind of the meat of it, but I do want to at least have 10 minutes for discussion. So I'm going to go through this quickly. The idea here is that on the bottom axis, you have, you know, when considering a particular habitat or any other element that you want to represent in your landscape, you look at the percentage of it that's already conserved. And the left axis is the relative benefit of conserving the next hectare of that habitat. Now, this continuous benefit function is kind of a new way of looking at things. It's continuous. So here we have, it's 25% of this habitat's been conserved, and according to this function, the relative benefit is 0.75. And it slides on down as we go. Now, you can imagine that what the science behind this approach is really in drawing the shape of this continuous benefit function. And in contrast, I should have put this in the same format, but here in contrast, this is the old way, or this is kind of the target-based approach way of doing things, where you identify a target. Sometimes it's an arbitrary process for identifying that target. And then when your site selection algorithm is working, it is saying, okay, until we preserve that target, it's just as important to conserve that habitat, even if it's 24% than if it was 1%. But then once we've met that target, it's not important at all to conserve that habitat at all anymore. So getting back to this way, the continuous benefit function, the shape of the curve is pretty important, and the relative y-intercept of the curve is also important. This is kind of an experimental thing that I actually might toss out. But this is based on how much of the habitat has actually already been destroyed historically, might influence its relative y-intercept compared to other habitats. So this gray habitat, almost all of its habitat intact. But this next iteration of the model, I'm thinking of making this part optional, whether or not you want to differentiate between these two. But the next parts are more important. Another thing is an inflection point. I've added that inflection point to it. So the beginning of the slope can be a lot steeper than the end part of the slope. And also, an important thing that I've programmed into this is the fact that different types of conservation areas can have different types of influence in meeting this percent conserved. You know, I'm using air quotes right now for the word conserved because, as I mentioned before, if it's in a wilderness area, it's a lot more conserved than if it's on some working landscape owned by a timber company that's promising to do sustainable yield on that plot. You know, that second one might be conserved in the fact that it's not a shopping mall right now, but it's not as conserved as wilderness. But this function allows you to incorporate that shade of gray, and so it allows you to figure out where you are on this x-axis based on the quality of the habitat that's being conserved. And then finally, I've added a point where once you've met your inflection point, which is oftentimes the target that's traditionally been defined by previous scientists, you can actually allow the curve to drop down a certain level that's defined by the stakeholders or by the scientists. So this is a parameter. So this black line is you give a lot of credence to the target. And so once it meets that little inflection point, it goes all the way down. This mid-gray line is kind of in between the two. This thin black line doesn't give that much credence to targets at all. And so if we wanted to, I can show you. Here's a little Excel file that allows you to set these parameters. And since we're running short on time, I'll only maybe show a couple different ones. So here's that basic line. Here, if you want an initial flat line where it's flat for an initial like 5%, to do that. If you want your target to have a little bit more of an impact, do that. And if you want that initial downward slope not to be so steep, you can do that. So this could be kind of your generic shape for your curve that you parameterize for all the curves. So you can mess around with that with your stakeholder advisors to get the shape that you want. And you know, in eventual iterations, we can make it so you can define a shape for each curve. But right now, it's defined as the same set of shapes for all the curves. The same principle applies to species representation and structural element representation. We'll go over that bullet for now. And then that's the whole. There should be another slide saying now we're talking a little bit more about the solution set angle. But that was the whole continuous benefit function part, which we can go back to. But this I wanted to throw out there real quick. The algorithm used for creating these solution sets is a simple algorithm. It's what some people call the maximum gains heuristic or the greedy heuristic. And what it does is it goes through the entire landscape, identifies the site that has the highest value, or representation value, or whatever level you are in doing your heuristic. So it could be the highest conservation value based on all of your parameters, actual best site, and it says, okay, well, let's go ahead and conserve that site. Now, once we conserve that site, how does the landscape change? And it goes ahead and recalculates everything, and it identifies the next best site and says, okay, well, let's conserve that one. And it goes through until either you've met your budget or until you've met a different threshold that you've set. And so that's how you create your solution set. So it's not as slick in that regards as simulating annealing that's in Marksan, or it's definitely not as slick as doing integer linear programming. There's no way you can do ILP for such a complex analysis. Now, briefly breezing through all these, the connectivity algorithm that's part of it is the some people call least cost corridor. So it's based on least cost path, but it actually shows width of corridors instead of actual lines. And the way I have it programmed right now is instead of having a focal species parameterize your least cost corridor, I actually have the whole composition branch parameterizing your connectivity value. Again, this is all programmed in Model Builder with a little bit of scripting for the connectivity. The contiguity algorithm is really simple. Basically, you have your core areas, and then you just identify the sites that are next to the core areas. If you want, you can identify both your sites being if they're parcels, but also if they're properties, or if they're watersheds or sub-watersheds, and that's your connectivity value. You can do them in a weighted sum down here, and that's your contiguity value. It looks like something like that. So the highest contiguity value are in purple because they're both parcels and parameters and watersheds, and so on. Okay, yeah, so here's the updated thing where it's in weighted division, so I definitely got to update that part of the presentation. And in summary, this framework is in essence, it's a conservation planning framework that's a multi-criteria system, uses continuous benefit functions. It looks at different types of conservation, not just fee transfer, for instance. It looks at site assessment and solution set, and it compares action